Hello, everybody. I'm Dan Limbach, producer of the Pharma Voice Webcast Network. Welcome to our event entitled Agile Drug Development Required in a New Age of Urgency, brought to you by Pharma Voice in partnership with our good friends at Cognizant. We have an outstanding crowd today with executives from across the industry and around the world. This has quickly become one of our more popular webinars of the past 12 months. Thank you for investing the time to attend. We'll certainly do our very best to make it worth your while. We have a very knowledgeable panel of experts with us today to discuss how out-of-the-box thinking and technology can be applied to counter future global health emergencies. We're happy to welcome Srini Shankar, Senior Vice President, Global Head, Life Sciences at Cognizant. He's joined by Ulo Palm, MD, PhD, Senior Vice President, Digital Sciences, Allergan. Ulo is also Corporate Secretary at Transcelerate Biopharma, Inc. We also have Thomas A. Bach, MD, MBA, founder at Heritex, and he is chairman of the Healthcare Advisory Board at the Columbia Business School. He's also the former Senior Vice President, Global Head, Medical Affairs at Alexion Pharmaceuticals. It's an outstanding panel. Our panel discussion will be moderated by Taryn Grome, editor at Pharma Voice. After our panel discussion, remember, we will have a Q&A session in our remaining time, so please submit your questions as you think of them. Let's get to the discussion. Taryn, take it away.
Dan, thank you so much. And thank you, Cognizant. Thank you, panel. And thank all of you for joining us. The rapidly moving target of the coronavirus is challenging the best of the world's life sciences innovators. And the landscape changes not only by the day, but by the hour. Some of the most current efforts from across the industry that show promise for treating and preventing the disease include antivirals from the University of Minnesota, Gilead Sciences, Sanofi, and Takeda, and vaccines from GlaxoSmithKline, Inovio, Johnson & Johnson, Moderna Therapeutics, Pfizer, and Roche, and the list continues to grow. During our discussion today, we're going to cover the modern digital sciences and technologies that need to be leveraged to accelerate development of new therapies in epidemics and pandemics, while also enabling earliest possible access of promising and potentially life-saving new treatments to those affected. What are the prevailing industry norms, processes, and regulations, which have been largely unchanged for decades, but need to change to become agile enough to deal with accelerating global pandemics such as COVID-19? We'll also talk about the aspects of the regulatory approval process that need to be nuanced or fundamentally revisited in the face of increasing pandemics to ensure critically needed therapies reach patients. We'll talk about best practices from other countries that have rapidly provided access to novel treatments for patients in need during epidemics. And who's in charge? What are the stakeholders that need to be involved to make the necessary big leap? But before we get started, let's do a quick review of where we are as of today in terms of statistics and the latest developments. Thomas, what are you hearing from the field?
Well, the COVID-19 pandemic is threatening us both through its scope and scale and through its speed. So the latest numbers from Johns Hopkins are that globally we passed 400,000 cases, and CDC is saying that in the US we now have more than 33,000 cases with more than 400 deaths. But we also have to remember that over the last week, sometimes the numbers jumped 30 to 40% just from one day to the other. So that has two consequences. Number one, everything that needs to get done fast. And number two, this is going to be very personal for every single one of us, because we all will know somebody who actually is infected or whose life is actually at peril. Now, fortunately, the researchers and the industry have come up with a broad range of potential therapies. Now, you may have heard about an article yesterday about 69 potential therapies, and we already know that in China there are trials going on that are testing more than 100 compounds, and that includes traditional Chinese medicines. Now, none of these is approved by the FDA, and the range of what we know is very, very broad and different, from early preclinical experience to post-marketing experience in another disease, like for the drug chloroquine. So if we need to do everything that we have to do fast, then we also have to make sure that these drugs are being developed as soon as possible. And we all know that our traditional paradigm of developing drugs and medicines is very, very slow, and we wait for months and years until we look at the data and then essentially ensure patient access. So we have to do something different, something more agile, something more dynamic, something faster, and that's why we're here.
Srini, did you have some comments that you wanted to add?
Sure. Thank you, Thomas. I think the only thing that I would state that is additive as it relates to recent statistics is it's very encouraging to see that just in the past week alone, the number of emergency use authorizations that have been accorded for diagnostics manufacturers, whether that's the equipment or the reagents, leads us to believe and be optimistic that in about 2 weeks or even less, we're going to have millions of diagnostic kits available here in North America and around the world as well. That will create a significant patient population that from where we can actually derive clinical metrics. So the one thing I would add is diagnostics has caught up or is fast catching up. Therapy, it's time for the therapies to catch up, and that's really the subject of today's conversation.
And let's continue with that theme. Thomas touched on it just a second ago, but why is it now are we in such an age of urgency for drug development? And what do we mean by urgency and agility in drug development?
Sure. If you really think about it, Darren, it really breaks down into 3 things. The first is really emergency guidelines in drug development for pandemic situations like this. One could argue that there are already many guidelines for accelerated approvals. You've got fast approval or fast track approvals. You've got priority access approvals. You've got accelerated therapy approvals, breakthrough therapy approvals. None of those constructs or approval constructs really fit into the realm of what is needed here from a regulatory standpoint. So that's the first aspect of it. The second aspect of it is the fundamental paradigm of randomized clinical trials or RCTs. RCTs have a place in medicine. They take time. They're largely sequential. What we need here in the face of a global pandemic are what we're going to talk about a little further, which is our accelerated real-world evidence trials, right? Which in some sense are invoked in emergency situations, taking away nothing away from randomized clinical trials, but then that's the need of the hour. And the third aspect is really technology to enable these accelerated real-world evidence trials. I mean, there are technologies today that we'll talk about further that weren't available even 5 years back that allow you to get real-time access to real-world evidence data to truly determine efficacy and safety without actually going through, the long process of randomized clinical trials. So we'll touch upon all these 3 aspects in today's conversation.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Those are great points. We know that drug development, the process has been largely unchanged for decades, and it still works, as you said, for developing drugs for prevailing indications such as diabetes and psoriasis. But when we get into the need for urgent reaction and urgent care, we're not there yet. Ulo, I know you have some definite thoughts on this topic. You want to jump in here?
Yeah, thank you, Talon. And let me for a second go back to what Srini highlighted. He highlighted that there are so many new things that are currently being developed. And let me start with the good news. The good news is that the early development is nowadays so productive. I'm absolutely amazed to see and hear what is coming out of the pharma labs, what's coming out of our academic labs. There are so many opportunities and options to treat COVID-19. The bad news is that the clinical phase is completely failing us because it cannot simply keep up with the speed of viral replication we have here. So why is the clinical phase failing us? Let me go back a little bit into the history of randomized controlled trials. Many people don't realize that randomized controlled trials were invented in the 1940s. And they are using mainly what's called the frequentist approach, the Fisher statistics. Sir Ronald Fisher, who is, when you look at him in Wikipedia, he is called the father of modern biostatistics. He was born in 1890. He developed this concept of the p-value in his book 1925. So while I absolutely agree that he was a genius, but he was a genius for his time. So this was way before anybody knew what digital meant, what big data meant, cloud computing, not to speak of neural networks, artificial intelligence. So we have to realize that the tools we are still using today, randomized controlled trials, Fisher statistic, was developed in a much slower age. And that's why the RTTs may not be right today. And let me be very clear also, I've been for more than 30 years in drug development. I have run countless RCTs. I have spent probably thousands of hours going to data listings, trying to understand why the p-value is this way or the other way, running sensitivity analysis. And these tools are important. They have their place, but there's a tendency to turn them into a hammer, and everything becomes a nail. So, but we have to realize that the pandemic is not a nail where we can use a hammer. We have to use different approaches, modern digital sciences, in order to move on. And we are going to speak about that more in details later, and I think Thomas is going to address it. But we also need to look at the ethical aspects. In clinical research, we cannot overemphasize that we are dealing with people's lives. So randomized controlled trials are often placebo controlled. So people say, well, it has to be, we don't have much information, we have to use placebo. But often I beg to differ, because often it is defined that no information means no RCT outcomes. We have often so much information from preclinical, from animal studies, which definitely indicates that a certain drug is working more effectively, probably more effectively than placebo. So it is a very important ethical decision to put patients in a randomized controlled trials where they have 50% chance of getting a placebo. So think about just if it's your grandma, if it's yourself, you know that's the only life-saving option you have, and you are being forced to choose between between not going on a trial or have only a 50% chance that you may get a good treatment. So with that, I hand it over to Thomas to talk about more maybe about the ethical aspects, and then later let's talk about then what are the alternatives, what can we do in our modern digital age where we don't have to rely on only on these RCTs, which let me say one more point. We have to remember that setting up RCTs takes months, that running them takes months to years, getting results, analyzing it takes months again. And if you look at now what we heard in the beginning from Thomas, that the number of infected people is doubling daily. So you see, it's a completely different time frame. Thomas, you want to add to that?
I'm happy to. I mean, the thing is really, I think we have to recognize that in a crisis situation like this, the default, the baseline scenario is that many patients are likely to die. It's not if we do nothing, if we do the same thing all over again. That's the baseline scenario that we have to break through. So in a life-threatening situation, you know, trial patients are essentially 50% of trial patients are withheld effective, potentially effective drug and potentially life-saving drug. And outside the clinical trial, which is the rest of the world, is essentially has to wait months or years until they get access. A few years ago, I mean, I was part and participating in an epidemic in Germany where it was very clear, not only for physicians and us at the company, but also for regulators and the IRBs that we in an emergency situation contacted right away. It was very clear that this situation to withhold potentially effective therapy and potentially life-threatening therapy was really not appropriate and unethical. And that's why traditionally we have started compassionate use programs. Now, the thing is that compassionate use programs should not just be there to help individual patients, but we should do it systematically and really use them to dynamically and from day one gather the data on safety and efficacy and make our conclusions not in 5 months or 10 months when it's too late for most of the patients, but real time and dynamically. And that's the big difference, because that's the only way to save those lives who otherwise would not be able to be saved.
Thomas, what would it take to enact that kind of compassionate use program on a widespread basis?
Well, I let the technology aspects to Srini in a moment, but what it takes from right at the beginning is an alliance, a coalition of the medical community, the medical leadership, the leadership of the regulatory authority of the countries, and certainly also of the company that has the product candidate. Because essentially, and that includes the board, because this is taking or requiring a massive relocation of resources, a different kind of speed, and it requires a different risk posture from the entire, for all stakeholders. But that is essentially mandated by the risk of lives. Now, this is what we had at the time, and this is essentially what's critically needed. In addition, an enabler to do this very fast and quickly is the technology, and so the technology companies are a critical part of that coalition to really make it happen.
Fantastic, and we're going to get to that technology piece in a minute, but let's talk about, if we create this more agile approach, then what aspects of the regulatory approval process need to be nuanced or revisited in the face of increasing pandemics, to really ensure that we take, as you said earlier, a patient-centric approach to make sure therapies reach those in need, because people are dying and the need is urgent. Thomas, why don't you kick us off again? I know that this is a topic near and dear to your heart.
Well, I think the critical piece is that we should not wait until a broad number of patients have access to the drug, which we traditionally do based on the regulatory provisions and also our traditional drug development, and then wait until the end, this one day where everyone opens the database and says, well, this is good or not good, and we don't even know for which patients it's best, because we have started with a very narrow population in the first place. So rather than doing that, I think this coalition, particularly also the regulator, should allow a very broad access of patients, because that's the only way to save the lives, to potentially save the life, I have to say at this time, who are at stake now. And the regulators have to be really allowing this, and then essentially allowing not a one-time process down the road, but a dynamic process of establishing the confidence in the safety and the efficacy of the product.
Fantastic. Now, can you think about it as a stepped process? What steps would need to be taken? Is it parallel? Is it sequential development?
Well, if you ask me, the first thing is really that you have to ensure that there is a broad access of patients. Right now, not a narrow, relatively broad, so physicians at the front lines need to have access to the drug and being able to provide it broadly. It will be a relatively mixed population, but that's the only way, essentially, how to employ and get the potential benefits right now. The second piece is, because we all want to mitigate safety and risks and really minimize those safety risks, is that this data has to be reported real time and reviewed and analyzed every single day, day by day. So that essentially if a safety signal would come up that wasn't predicted, that we would immediately be able to realign and maybe even discontinued that type of the program or that kind of the program. So we're used to that actually, to monitor safety real time, because we have safety monitoring committees. What we're not used to is the third piece, that we also have to monitor efficacy real time and really conclude not in 5 months or 10 months or 2 years, but we have to conclude also every single day, what is the current safety and efficacy profile. And by new patients coming in and by longer durations, we will get to that confidence level that we traditionally have from our randomized clinical trials. So the critical piece here is that the technology that we have available needs to be applied quickly to allow this real-time dynamic day-by-day monitoring of the safety and efficacy profile, and then make conclusions why we go.
And Ulo, at the same time, though, we shouldn't do all this at the risk of scientific robustness, right? We need to make sure that we have the right science in place as well.
Absolutely. But let me say something about scientific robustness. When you listen sometimes to people in that field, through statisticians, but also KOLs, they state, oh, randomized controlled trials are the gold standard. So we need to be very clear that in terms of scientific robustness, randomized controlled trials have a lot of limitations. And in fact, it is a known or it's known among scientists that randomized controlled trials very frequently cannot be replicated. It was in 2005 when a mathematician and physician from Stanford, John Ioannidis, he wrote an article that got so much, that created so much feedback and resonance in the scientific community. And the title of the article was "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False." So I'm not necessarily saying that this is the fault of randomized controlled trials alone, but what I simply want to also my fellow scientists who are fans, complete fans of randomized controlled trials, to recognize that this is not the only science we consider. This is not a gold standard. And if they claim it is a gold standard, then we need to move on to a platinum standard. So we need to move beyond that. So what are the alternatives? The alternatives, enabled through today's technology, and Srini will talk about that more, are nationwide, maybe even global, real-world evidence trials. Real-world evidence means that patients are treated by their physicians. It's the physicians who make the real-world calls how to treat them, instead of having a protocol that prescribes exactly what needs to be done. So these patients are treated in their actual setting and their healthcare centers or at home, and we collect that data. We collect that data through different means and bring it all together to a control center where we can analyze the data, as Thomas mentioned, in real time. In real time, we can run descriptive statistics. We can use time series analysis. So back when I was in academia, I did quite some work on time series analysis. We can even apply machine learning, neural networks where it's appropriate. We can use the full power of modern digital science to analyze the data that's streaming in from the patient in real time. And what is very important, what you also may hear from regulators or from proponents of the RCT only, oh, it's about the safety of individual patients. We first have to know more about the drugs before we give it to the broader population. This real-time monitoring creates, in my view, more safety, puts the patient in a much safer place than many randomized controlled trials, because the data is monitored on an ongoing basis. So, as we talked about what needs to change in the regulatory space, Well, we need to, number one, we need to recognize that there are more tools than just RCTs. There are this real world evidence, which is, and I think Srini, you said before that we have tools that weren't 5 years ago, weren't available. We have it now. We can leverage it in this crisis. And this allows us really to solve the ethical issue of randomized controlled trials. Patient first. This technology puts the treatments the patients need out there. Every patient that needs treatment should get treatment. So let me summarize what I think the new regulation should allow. The new regulation should allow that promising investigational treatments get conditional approval so that manufacturers can ramp up production and ship their promising drugs to every hospital that needs them, so that physicians at the front lines, they have something in their hands, they can make treatment decision. This conditional approval needs to be monitored, and as I said, can be monitored through real world evidence trial. But most important is that we put patients first, and patients get the most promising investigative drugs, instead that they have to die because the physicians don't have access to anything new. That would be the right regulation in a pandemic. Conditional monitored approval as quickly as possible, real world evidence trials, and then we move on from there.
That was excellent, Ulo. Thank you so much for sharing all of those great points with us. Srini, let's dig in a little bit deeper into this technology aspect. As you all have alluded, that there are technologies that are already available to help counter some of the gaps that we're facing today. Why don't you tell us about that?
Sure. I love the reference to the platinum standard, which is absolutely what we need through pragmatic real-world evidence trials that both Ulo and Thomas spoke about. You know, technology can enable that today. And the underlying capability there is real-time monitoring and analysis, right? Today, you have platforms and tools that can provide you a real-time view across EMR, EHR systems in a very, effective, through a very effective visualization where you can actually do slicing and dicing of that data based on therapy. Those technologies did not exist earlier. They're actually available today. Interoperability between EMR, EHR systems is significantly higher than what it was just a few years back. So that technology to actually look at hundreds of thousands, in case hundreds of millions of patient records and provide you with longitudinal clinical data is absolutely there and available today. So the first aspect is data availability, which is an underlying precondition for all of this stuff. The second aspect is patient access, right? I think, we've seen overwhelming sentiment when we support clinical trials where trials are delayed because you're not able to find patients. Patient recruitment is the long pole in the tent. When you look at something like COVID-19, we know who the patients are. The governments know who the patients are. Municipalities and local counties know who the patients are. So patient recruitment identification is not a challenge at all here. Patient access can be enabled very quickly. We can spin up call centers in 24 to 48 hours that can actually register patients and walk them through any education that's needed for them to be actually reporting clinical metrics. Patient access is also enabled through tools and capabilities like EPRO, which is patient-reported outcomes. A good number of patients who are not in critical condition are advised not to visit hospitals for obvious reasons because they, stand the risk of infecting others and healthcare workers. So they're self-quarantined or quarantined at home. They can actually report clinical metrics through very simple apps that are already out there, right? So patient access, reporting clinical metrics, all of those technologies exist today that weren't really available, a few years back. So that's the second aspect of it. The first is data. The second is patient access. The third is advanced visualization and analytics, right? I'll give you an example in a different industry, right? If you look at the consumer context, whether it's beverages or restaurants, diapers, a lot of, consumer products, a lot of the companies who have leading brands in those spaces actually have visualization mechanisms where they get real-time information on public sentiment or sales or whatever associated with their brands across the world. We've actually built some of those platforms for some of our clients. So, if the technology to visualize real time, to predict real time, is available in a consumer context, and you can do that for sugared water, you can do that for diapers, and you can do that in restaurants, you absolutely can do that, and we owe it to ourselves to do that for, in a public health crisis like this, right? So it's absolutely out there. These technologies are actually proven in other industries, and it is absolutely true that in the case of life sciences and in drug development specifically, the paradigm hasn't really, the drug development paradigm hasn't really caught up with the availability of these kind of technologies. So I think it really breaks down into those three things. You have data, so technology that can be enabled, real-time monitored and assessed. You've got patient access. Patient recruitment is not an issue in this case because we know who they are. And the third aspect is you've got advanced visualization with some of the stuff that Ulu talked about around neural networks and AI, where we can actually predict, in some cases, safety and efficacy in real time, which is something that Thomas mentioned, that you have to really get to being able to predict efficacy and safety in real time. So those are some of the developments in amply available technologies which need to be brought it very quickly into this context. And I know, Ulo, you've had a lot of experience in looking at disruptive technologies and pervasive technologies in your role as head of digital sciences. So I'd love to get your views also on this.
Oh, absolutely, Srini. I have to say I've spoken to so many scientists, so many mathematicians, so many artificial intelligence specialists, to machine learning experts. It's absolutely amazing the amount of new technology, new methods that are currently being developed. Of course, I understand that all these new methods, as some people say, are unproven. That's why there's a natural tendency to stick to what we know. But as we talked about in this panel, this what we know fails us in this modern world where, as Thomas also over and over said again, people are dying. So let me bring one aspect up. This is risk-benefit analysis. So we have to think about it if we use these modern methods for substantial evidence generation. So that is a term also in the regulation. We need to create substantial evidence. And unfortunately, substantial evidence generation is by a lot of people and also regulators linked to randomized controlled trials. So it's very, very difficult to get a change in the mindsets there. But in this pandemic, I don't think that we have a choice than changing our mindset. So we need to ask us a question. What is the risk that a new methodology has confounding factors in we don't see is going to lead us astray, and based on an analysis of this new technology, we make treatment decision as the front line? No question, there are definitely risks involved. But we have to weigh that risk that the new treatment may create harm to a patient. We need to weigh it against the risks when we know that the patient has already COVID-19. We know what the risk is, what's going to happen. This patient may end up on a respirator, this patient may die. So we have to think about it, what is more risky? Using a modern approach that is not yet 100% proven, or leaving patients without a treatment option where we know exactly what the virus can do. So this is what we have to keep in mind, and this has to be a patient-centric approach. Patient first, life of patients first, and not necessarily purity of a science which was developed admittedly by genius in the last century, but we have to move on.
So if I may add quickly, because some in the audience may think this what Srini and Ulo alluded to requires too much change, particularly in a time of crisis. Well, this let me give you an example how this has already been done. Actually, I mentioned my experience in managing epidemic crisis in the healthcare system in northern Germany. This was in 2011, where hospitals got overwhelmed by thousands of incoming patients that experienced life-threatening complications due to Shiga toxin-producing E. coli. So we had an investigational therapy available that we knew from Alexion's experience in another disease that was really well tolerated. That's exactly, one of the conditions that that Ulla was alluding to, and there where we already had preliminary experience from patients that had exactly the disease that was causing that epidemic and that crisis. So we are exactly in that situation in which we are now, but today it's of course multiple levels worse and faster. So with the support of all the stakeholders I mentioned, and I must say we got, once the a certain medical society approached us, we got agreement, directional agreement between the head of the German FDA, between the chairman of the board of the company, between the CEO of the company, between the heads of the leadership of the medical society within hours. I mean, this is the level of urgency that it is. We started the call center in 24 hours. We had patient access program running in 48 hours. We moved this into a agreed, approved clinical program, real-world evidence program that was completed and approved in 6 weeks. We merged the data right away, and during all this time, every night we looked at the data of every single patient and essentially ensured that we did the right thing, that we didn't miss a safety signal, and so on. So this way, it was really possible within a few weeks to change the curve of the crisis and also essentially to move ahead. 9 months later, it was a late-breaking plenary presentation at ASA, and the data was made public immediately. So that is possible, and I must say, well, at the time, this was 2011, we were stretching the limit of data communication and logistics. With modern technology that is readily available right now, this is much more scalable to the level that we can do it for the whole world right now.
It's a great example, Thomas. Thank you so much for sharing it with our audience. And it shows how when you get all the right people at the table, how quickly things can move. So how do we bring all those right people to the table today? And as we look at the future, we know this is not the first pandemic that we're going to face as a global community. So how do we move forward? Who are the stakeholders who need to be at the table right now to move the paradigm? And let's start with you, Ulo.
Well, the most important stakeholder, and you have said it before, the most important stakeholder is a patient. And if the patient can speak for him or herself, it's the loved ones of that patient. These are the most important stakeholders. I think we are in 2020, we should have gotten beyond that point where we think that, oh, we in science, we in politics, we make decisions for patients. No, we need to ask patients what you want, what level of risk are you willing to take, and then listen to the patient instead of making decisions in an ivory tower. Okay, patients are given, but then, of course, stakeholders, very, very important, are the regulators, global regulators in the United States, the FDA, the CDC needs to be on board, the government, we need to bring the governments on board, and then we need to engage the private sector. We have in the United States such a powerful private sector with so many resources. They want to get involved. I have been talking to many technology companies. The companies, they are like Cognizant. They are willing to step up to build and deliver solutions. But for some reason, I don't know why, the private sector is not brought in so that the private sector can help. And then, of course, all the pharmaceutical companies that have this amazing products in early development, we need to also make sure that they can ramp up production. We need to make sure that we don't simply expect them to bear all the costs, because ramping up production through millions of patients costs money, and they need also support from the society, so that these amazing products that are coming out of the laboratories, that these amazing products get to the patient as soon as possible. And as soon as possible, I mean long before we are setting up and running the randomized controlled trials.
Thomas, let me ask you, what role does academia play in this?
Well, in the end, it's the treating physician who is at the front line of this effort. And certainly academia or even non-academia, the treating physician is the major stakeholder. That is often also the stakeholder that is clearly adamant about the inappropriateness of randomization, because they see essentially the urgency right away. So very important, I think, in the end, this is a medical decision that everyone else is supporting with whatever they can deliver to solve this medical crisis, and so that's really, that's really critical. Patient in the center, as Ulo was saying, but essentially the person who makes it happen on the front line is the medical community. If I may add, one stakeholders are the local or the IRBs, the institutional review boards, and it's very important to involve them right from the front to really keep them informed of all the evidence. And when you have your medical stakeholders together and they are clear in their essentially need and in their ethical commitment that this is the right thing to do, this is where IRBs who are independent and continue to have to make independent decisions, but where they are essentially have the same urgency, get the same urgency to make these decisions very, very fast.
Excellent, thank you. Sometimes we don't always think about all those different layers, so thank you for bringing that IRB to bear. Srini, why don't you round us out here? Who else, in your opinion, needs to be at the table? We know that government is crucial. We know private companies, both pharma and tech, consortia. Who else? What are we doing?
No, I think Ulo and Thomas pretty much summed it up. I think it's a combination of regulatory bodies and government authorities who are closely examining the need for FEMA-type guidelines, where we are allowed to operate under those guidelines for an interim period that's invoked through an executive order, so that we don't have to resort just to randomized controlled trials that we've talked about a lot in this session. I think private companies have a huge role to play here. I think it's really great to see some of the leaders on the diagnostic side really step up. I mean, I think you saw a lot of announcements for companies to use under the EUA authorization. Companies like Abbott, Hologic, Thermo Fisher, Roche Diagnostics, and that gives me a lot of hope and optimism that in 2 weeks or less, we're going to have millions of diagnostic kits that actually represent an opportunity for us to quickly get to a patient population that will give us the enough clinical data points for us to actually get to that level of desired output when it comes to measuring safety and efficacy. So it's a combination of different people really chartered to do different things. I think the pharma companies need to really step up in terms of, coming forward with investigational therapies. I think there's an element of collaboration in a pre-competitive setting, if you think about it, that can happen here, where you can build industry platforms. I think it was Thomas or Ulo, one of you mentioned like 69 or 70 potential candidates out there. Like if everybody sets up their own control and placebo arm, it's just not going to be effective at all. So I think there's an opportunity for a consortia-led approach to come together and to bring a lot of the pharma companies who are effectively going to be chartered with coming out with an antiviral or a vaccine so that we can get more of a crowdsourced effort on this one going. And I think the one thing I would state is, just to close this out, unprecedented times require unprecedented measures, right? This industry, unfortunately, has generally resorted to a conventional approach, and there's been an inertia for departing from that conventional approach. Some of that is warranted. We all know about, the thalidomide crisis 50 years back, and all of some of the safety issues that the industry has faced over the years. But these are very, very difficult and unprecedented times. And we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to humanity to explore any and all avenues, however unconventional they may seem, to accelerate a therapy into market, because the human consequences, the public health consequences, the economic consequences, the social consequences of operating in a quarantine, lockdown kind of environment for prolonged periods, we don't know what they're going to be, right? I don't think anybody has an accurate assessment of the impact, broader socioeconomic, impact of all of this stuff. So this is an unprecedented time, and we have to resort to unconventional measures.
Well said. And that's a great segue to ask you all for your final thoughts before we head into our Q&A session. So Ulo, give us your final thoughts on this topic, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, thank you, Taran. We have to recognize, we have to acknowledge the fact that, building on what Srini said, that we are, as a global community, we are in a situation we haven't been for more than 100 years. Let's face that. People are dying now in large numbers. And this is also my appeal to my fellow scientists. This brutal fact that people are dying now in large numbers should determine which science we use. So no scientific method is absolute. And that's also true for RCTs. They are not absolute. We need to be very careful that we are not unintentionally sacrificing the lives of our fellow human beings for the perceived purity of randomized controlled trials. We have to move here at the speed of viral replications.
I love that. Thomas?
Well, a crisis like this requires leadership and the courage to do the things that make sense. And, we must and we can develop therapies faster. We must provide patient access upfront and early on, and then monitor dynamically in real time the progress and make the conclusions dynamically in real time and readjust. Because the fast and early access is the only way to seize the opportunity to save the patients who are, threatened right now. And so as leaders, I think we must always act and remember that we are not only responsible for what we do, but also responsible for what we do not do. And this is, I believe, the exact moment to not only say it, but also do it.
Agreed. Srini, why don't you round us out?
Sure. Just on, going with the theme, perfection is the enemy of progress here, right? I just love what Ulo mentioned. We have to act at the speed, or perhaps faster than the speed of viral replication. That's what we're dealing with here. The technology enablement for us to do that is absolutely out there and well within our reach, right? This is not like landing somebody in Mars, right? So that's what I would say. I think the acknowledgement that we need a different set of guidelines, we've discussed that. Alternatives to randomized controlled trials, we've discussed that. And the enablement that through of all of this through technology, and the availability of that technology and the pervasive availability of technologies, and the fact that they're proven in other industries, we've discussed that as well. So That's what I would say.
I want to thank you all very much. This has been very informative, and I love the passion and compassion that you have on this topic. And when we look at the technology that is available currently to change the paradigm of drug development to be more agile to address this urgent need for patients is more important than ever. So thank you for bringing up so many great points. And if you don't mind, now we're going to turn to our audience because we do have quite a few questions coming in. So I will direct them to you as they have come in. Srini, there's one here for you, if you don't mind. The question is, across various geographies across the globe, with regard to identifying patient subjects, how can this be done? We know we can do it in the US, but is there a way to do it globally?
Absolutely. I think, I talked about this, that, we all know who those patients are, in the sense that we don't know them personally, but the fact that government bodies, the local municipalities, the counties are keeping track of who those patients are, it's not a challenge of patient identification for us to get clinical metrics from those patients. It does require a level of coordination when you look at the international context with other governments and equivalents of the CDC and NIH that exist in those countries. I believe, and this is my surmise, that the willingness of those countries is absolutely there. If there's one silver lining from all of this, is that it is in some sense uniting the world against a common enemy. So if the US were to take a lead in doing this, I do not believe that other governments in other countries that have access to those patients would resist in any way, because this is a global issue that is hurting all of us.
Excellent. This question is for you, Thomas, and you, Ulo, which goes back to the ethics of it. So why should we have a placebo while there are subjects confirmed with COVID-19? And why can't we use their blood to separate the antigen of those infectious subjects to develop antibodies faster? Now that science part is for you all. Thomas, you want to jump in first?
Well, yes, I definitely think we should move in different directions and or multiple directions at the same time, because we certainly don't know the winner yet. And that's certainly what this platform or approach is also about. But yes, indeed, I mean, patients or people who went through the infection already certainly could be a very interesting, appealing, promising source of not only identifying targets, but maybe indirectly, there was this plasma approach highlighted yesterday to essentially create therapies or potential therapies, I have to say, more quickly. I think the approach about placebo we have discussed early on. It puts essentially a big challenge in terms of withholding therapy for 50% of the patients. But the data that we will get through this platform approach will certainly include patients who will not, unfortunately, I must say, have had the opportunity to receive therapy for geographic reasons, for logistic reasons, for whatever. So we will actually have patients who are not randomized, but who will probably not have had the access to those therapies, and those data should also be considered when we make our final conclusions.
And
if I may add, sorry, go ahead, Ulo.
To the antibody part, there are companies there that have already identified antibodies. They have they are able to produce antibodies or even triple antibodies against the coronavirus. However, between that amazing work in the laboratory and the patient bedside is a phase in the clinical development phase. And if you want to do all randomized controlled trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, it will take years.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add to that is the ability to actually collect plasma from patients who've developed antibodies against COVID-19 has been limited to some extent by diagnostics. The more you diagnose, the more people know that they've actually had it, because some people are asymptomatic, and the more they will give plasma with, and you'll have more antibodies. So I think, now with diagnosis going up, you clearly can conceive that avenue as a very viable option.
Excellent. Here's another question, coming in. What are the chances that we will see another new virus in the imminent future? Anybody have a crystal ball?
Well, if I might take it, I think you don't need a crystal ball for that. It's a given in our modern world where we travel, millions of people travel around the globe. It's a natural process. It's nature that a new virus may come around, and the next virus may not be a coronavirus. It may be a deadly bird, swine, or who knows what type of influenza virus. We know this can come. So we need to have regulation, drug development, paradigms and regulations for pandemics in place. Otherwise, 2019, 2020 is going to repeat over and over again.
Excellent. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to pose the last question, and this can go for all three of you. We've talked so much about technology today, but what are the best technologies to apply during this time to ensure we're targeting the right patients for the right therapy, responders versus non-responders, for example? Is there a precision medicine approach that we should take? And then secondly, how can this data be shared in real time across the board so everyone equally benefits? Srini, you want to start with you, and we'll go down the line.
Look, so I think I'll take the latter part. The first question is more scientific, and I'd probably give it to the two PhDs and MDs in the panel. But how can data be shared more broadly? That problem has been solved. I think there are data standards through APIs where data can be shared across systems today much more seamlessly than in the past. I think we spoke briefly here about that you can easily enable a visual command center at any location like the CDC or the NIH, where you have data streams coming in from multiple data sources, all of which may be fundamentally different from one another. But there's enough data interoperability standards through open APIs available today where you can actually get that data and seamlessly visualize it across multiple sources. But the other question on the which is a more medical question, I request Ulo and Thomas to take that.
Yeah, let me comment on that. So the questionnaire asked personalized medicine. So in this crisis, personalized medicine is trust your frontline treating physicians, because this is such a complex disease, different phases from very mild to very severe. Our amazing healthcare workers and physicians, they are the ones who need to personalize the treatment. And what we are proposing here is that these treatment decisions, which probably going to happen, unfortunately, millions of times, that we collected through our a real world evidence system, so that the data is collated, analyzed, and feedback can be provided to the frontline physician, which treatment works and doesn't never work. This is personalized medicine, which we have to apply in this pandemic. Thomas?
Yeah, I think the key thing is that if you're really in crisis management, it's like on a battlefield. I mean, if you don't have time, you have to act. Things are overwhelming, stressful, staff is exhausted. So the key thing here is to apply technology that is simple and intuitive, and that works relatively broadly and easily. And I was amazed when actually Srini and us met just a few weeks ago and discussed opportunities. It's amazing what's already out there in other areas, even in the consumer space, that could be quickly adopted. But it's just for medicine. We haven't used some of the upsides yet that could be used. So essentially, I think we have the technology. needs to be simple, easy, and certainly consumer friendly, because the follow-up in some of the data have not only to be put in by the healthcare providers, but it has to be merged with some primary consumer patient-reported outcomes data.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Srini, Thomas, Ulo. Thank you to Cognizant, and thank you to our active participants for being part of our webinar today. Thank you, and everyone stay well.
Thank you. Be well, and thank you for having us.
Thank you.